Japan just sanctioned over 100 Chinese tech companies. Days later, factories across the country started going dark. No explosions, no declarations of war, just silence. Welcome to the world's first invisible blockade, and it's being executed with nothing more than paperwork. A couple of weeks back, Tokyo announced what seemed like a routine geopolitical maneuver. The Japanese government publicly blacklisted more than 100 Chinese technology firms, citing national security concerns and the risk of dual-use technologies ending up in military applications. Officials in Japan anticipated the typical diplomatic dance: sharp words from Beijing, quiet nods of approval from Washington, maybe a stern editorial or two in the Global Times, and then everyone would move on. But what happened next caught nearly everyone off guard. Shortly after Japan's export control list went live, something peculiar began unfolding in the logistics networks connecting China to Japan. Rare earth shipments, the lifeblood of modern manufacturing, simply stopped arriving. There were no public announcements, no official embargo declarations, no angry press conferences. One week, the cargo containers were moving smoothly through ports in Shanghai and Tianjin. The next week, they weren't. In Japan's industrial heartland, particularly around Nagoya, automotive manufacturers began frantically making calls to suppliers. Electric vehicle production lines depend on high-performance magnets made from rare earth elements. Without them, motors can't be built. Engineers in semiconductor plants started checking their material inventories, only to discover that stockpiles were dangerously low, far lower than procurement teams had anticipated. Within just a few days, the truth became undeniable. Japan's sanctions hadn't simply provoked retaliation. They had triggered an unintended supply crisis, a silent chokehold created by overlapping restrictions from both Tokyo and Beijing. But the roots of this crisis stretch back much further than a single blacklist. For nearly the entire year, China had been methodically tightening its control over the minerals that make the modern world function. These aren't just ordinary commodities. Rare earth elements power electric vehicle motors, enable satellite communications, drive industrial robotics, and guide precision missiles. They are invisible to most consumers, but they are absolutely critical to national economies and military arsenals. Then, in October, Beijing introduced yet another layer of bureaucratic control: new application forms, new licensing requirements, new inspection protocols. Export approvals that used to take 4 weeks were now stretching into 3 months or longer. The entire system slowed to a crawl. The data painted a stark picture. By September, China's rare earth exports had collapsed by more than 30% compared to August. Finished magnet shipments, the actual products that automakers and defense contractors depend on, nosedived shortly after a brief summer recovery. And because China processes the overwhelming majority of the world's rare earth materials, any slowdown in China becomes a crisis everywhere else. When Japan's blacklist collided head-on with China's freshly tightened export regime, it created a feedback loop. Each restriction amplified the other. Every week, the squeeze got tighter. The impact on factory floors was swift and brutal. Suzuki's production line for the Swift model in Shizuoka Prefecture had to shut down twice between May and June. Suppliers, speaking off the record, pointed directly to shortages caused by export approval delays in China. When shipments finally resumed, assembly lines restarted. But plant managers understood the uncomfortable truth. The problem hadn't been solved, it had only been delayed. And all of this chaos was unfolding during a major political transition in Tokyo. After the unexpected resignation of Prime Minister Ishiba, Japan's parliament installed Sanae Takaichi as the country's first female prime minister. Within days of taking office, her administration unveiled an ambitious industrial revival plan. The focus areas were unmistakable: defense technology, artificial intelligence, aerospace engineering, and next-generation semiconductor chips. But even as Tokyo pivoted its economic strategy toward high-tech sovereignty, Japan's finance minister, Katsunobu Kato, issued a stark public warning. China's increasingly restrictive export policies, he said, represented a genuine threat to Japan's economic stability. He called on the G7 nations to develop a unified response. By late October, Japan and the United States signed a new framework agreement to cooperate on nuclear energy development and rare earth supply chain resilience. On paper, it was a meaningful diplomatic step, but symbols and signatures can't replace physical materials. And when it comes to rare earths, China still dominates every stage that matters: mining, chemical separation, refining, alloy production, and magnet manufacturing. Japanese trading houses tried to adapt. Sojitz Corporation, one of Japan's largest importers, began sourcing heavy rare earths from Lynas Corporation's processing facility in Malaysia, marketing it as a China-free alternative for sensitive defense and aerospace applications. But even Sojitz couldn't completely escape Chinese supply chains. Certain high-performance magnets and heat-resistant alloys are produced almost exclusively in China. No amount of strategic planning can eliminate that dependency overnight. And that's the uncomfortable reality facing not just Japan, but the entire industrialized world. The rare earth bottleneck isn't in the ground. It's not about finding new mines. The bottleneck is in the chemistry, the highly complex refining and separation processes that China has spent decades perfecting and heavily subsidizing. When Beijing decided to slow down export approvals again in October, shipments dropped immediately, and Japanese suppliers scrambled to secure whatever material they could get their hands on. Every major sector in Japan depends on a handful of rare earth elements that flow through the same Chinese licensing system. Electric vehicles, industrial robotics, aerospace components, defense hardware. All of it hinges on Beijing's willingness to approve exports. At the same time, Japan continued tightening its own export controls on advanced manufacturing equipment, much of which is used inside Chinese semiconductor fabrication plants. Beijing interpreted the move as another escalation, adding stress to both industries. Japanese equipment manufacturers, already restricted in what they could legally sell to Chinese chip makers, now faced longer approval times and more complicated compliance paperwork. These delays affect everything from routine maintenance schedules to next year's revenue forecasts. Just days ago, Tokyo Electron, Japan's largest semiconductor equipment supplier, publicly acknowledged that the new export restrictions were already hurting profitability, even as surging demand for AI-related chips kept the company's order backlog strong. The company is caught in a painful contradiction: booming demand, but shrinking access to one of its most important markets. For China, the most powerful weapon in 2025 hasn't been tariffs. It's been, well, paperwork, licensing procedures, inspection protocols, export approval delays. The Ministry of Commerce introduced stricter rules in the spring, and magnet exports fell to levels not seen since the COVID lockdowns. A temporary thaw in U.S.-China relations over the summer helped ease some of those restrictions, but October's regulatory updates brought the squeeze right back. Analysts noticed something new this time around. The updated controls didn't only apply to Chinese companies. They also affected foreign manufacturers who use Chinese materials or Chinese machinery in their production processes. In effect, Beijing extended its influence deep inside global supply chains, far beyond its own borders. This matters everywhere, from the electric vehicle factories of Aichi Prefecture to the aerospace manufacturing clusters of Ishikawa. China now controls close to 70% of global rare earth mining, around 85% of refining capacity, and roughly 90% of magnet production. From raw ore to finished motor component, China is the dominant force. For companies like Toyota and Denso, the consequences are unavoidable. Without elements like terbium and dysprosium, high-performance magnets can't withstand extreme heat. Without those magnets, there are no efficient electric vehicle motors. And without Beijing's export licenses, none of those materials leave China. Inside Tokyo's policy circles, one conclusion is becoming impossible to ignore. Japan can feel the pressure closing in, and policymakers are racing to secure a way out before another supply shock derails critical industries. To understand why this crisis runs so deep, you have to look past the headlines and examine the quiet strategic contest playing out between Japan, China, and the rare earth materials that power modern technology. Tokyo has spent years trying to construct a safety net for its critical minerals. Government funding has surged into new mining partnerships overseas. Trading giants are backing exploration projects in Africa, Australia, and Southeast Asia. Government ministries are rolling out advanced recycling systems designed to capture valuable metals from discarded electronics and industrial waste. On paper, this looks like meaningful progress toward independence. But the reality is far less reassuring. One of the few rare earth suppliers outside China, India, unexpectedly restricted its own rare earth exports in June. Officials in New Delhi framed it as a domestic security measure, aimed at protecting India's own industrial needs. But the impact on Japan was immediate. Tokyo lost a precious alternative source, one it had been quietly counting on. And this exposes Japan's fundamental problem. Even when raw materials originate outside China, many of the most important refinement and separation steps still take place inside Chinese facilities. Those extraction and chemical processing stages remain the true choke points, and Beijing controls them. As long as that's true, any Japanese attempt to diversify comes with an unavoidable dependency on Chinese approval. China has not been shy about using that leverage. Export approvals loosen and tighten with suspicious timing, often coinciding with sensitive diplomatic moments. When Washington reached a modest licensing understanding with Beijing earlier this year, European officials immediately rushed to negotiate similar terms. Even major economies are finding themselves dependent on Chinese bureaucratic goodwill. Inside Japan, the anxiety is increasingly visible. According to multiple reports, China has quietly pressured Tokyo to stop adding Chinese firms to its export control lists. Japan insists that its rules are tied strictly to national security concerns and the risk of weapons-related technology transfers, not geopolitics. But the business community isn't convinced the situation is stable or predictable. Manufacturers across the country, from automakers to robotics leaders to electronics giants, are now treating magnet inventories with the same level of seriousness they gave to semiconductor chips during the 2021 global shortage. The vulnerabilities are no longer hypothetical. A single missing motor component forced Suzuki to temporarily halt production earlier this year, revealing just how thin the supply buffer truly is. The core of the problem remains unchanged. China is still responsible for refining more than 90% of the world's rare earths and producing nearly all high-performance permanent magnets. When Chinese authorities slow the approval pipeline, Japanese factories feel the slowdown almost instantly. This reality has forced Tokyo into a two-track strategy, one that is inherently contradictory. On one hand, Japan is investing heavily alongside the United States to build new supply routes outside China. Trading houses like Sojitz are importing rare earth materials from Australia's Lynas facility. On the other hand, Japan is still quietly coordinating with Beijing, because some specialized materials and processing capabilities simply cannot be sourced elsewhere. Not yet. Maybe not for years. By early autumn, reports from within China made it clear that acquiring new export licenses had become significantly more difficult. A fresh round of regulatory tightening soon followed. These shifts came just as Japan's advanced technology sector, especially companies like Tokyo Electron, found themselves pulled in opposing directions, soaring global demand for AI-related semiconductor equipment versus stricter rules on exporting Japanese technology to China. Every decision feels like walking across a moving bridge. Despite all the diplomatic investments, all the diversification plans, all the public commitments, the fundamentals haven't changed. China's dominance in rare earth processing gives it decisive influence over global supply chains. That's why the United States and Japan are spending billions on diversification projects. That's why Europe continues pushing for guaranteed access agreements. Everyone wants to reduce dependence. But for now, China remains the gatekeeper. In early November, Japan's newly appointed Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, made supply chain security her first major policy initiative. She ordered the creation of an economic security strategy headquarters, tasked with mapping out long-term plans for semiconductors, defense industries, and advanced materials. Ministers have been instructed to prepare detailed development roadmaps for every critical industrial sector. But none of this changes the immediate reality. Japan's national security measures and its industrial needs are pulling in opposite directions. To protect itself strategically, Japan is expanding export controls on sensitive technologies. To keep its economy functioning, it still desperately needs materials refined inside China. Beijing, meanwhile, continues to use rare earths as a strategic pressure valve, quietly reminding the world that the transition to clean energy and high-performance electronics still runs through its industrial machinery. When all the analysis is stripped away, the power dynamic comes down to a very simple question. When a Japanese factory needs a high-strength permanent magnet made with rare earth materials that must pass through Chinese processing plants, who gets to decide whether that shipment is allowed to leave the port? That signature, more than any speech, policy paper, or military alliance, is where the real authority lies. And right now, that pen is in Beijing's hand. The future isn't being decided on battlefields. It's being decided in licensing offices, processing plants, and cargo manifests. Japan is learning a hard lesson. In the 21st century, the country that controls the minerals controls the machine, and the machine controls everything.